they're connected to one another, and a suggested way to connect those work items so that you get the progression and the risk management, overall risk management kind of documentation you're looking for. And then, of course, requirement structure, which is really project organization. So we essentially have two different discussions that you want to have when you're setting up your design control. The first one is, what are these logical elements that we use to connect to each other so that we get a proof that we're looking for? And the second is, where do those logical elements reside? What documents do they reside in, and how are you going to organize from a documentation standpoint what that project is going to look like? So just a couple different views of it. So we'll see if we can. Oh, there we go. Okay, so medical device design control. Essentially, what the regulation says is manufacturers will establish and document and maintain throughout the life cycle ongoing process identification hazards. And so also the outputs of the design shall be provided in a form that enables verification. So essentially what we're going to do is try to create a design control that fulfills those requirements. So in ISO, the 14971 2012 only, as I said before, currently applies to manufacturers placed in medical devices in the market in Europe. 2007 still applies. The ISO, the normalized standard, still applies in all areas outside of Europe. So 2007 allows for the manufacturer to discard negligible risks. So essentially what we have is this idea of ALARP, or as low as reasonably possible. So we can mitigate a risk, and then once we get to the place where it's not practical for us to mitigate the risk further, we can either make a justification on the basis of the benefit of the device, or we can say it's below our company standard for how high risk needs to be, and therefore we're going to not consider that risk, or drop it as something that we're mitigating. Well, this new process requires us to reduce risk as much as possible, which is a really difficult thing for us to do in this kind of an environment, in that economically it's just not possible to mitigate every line item risk as much as possible. So as a hedge to that, I think what we need to do is take a very holistic view of our overall design controls and try to have a mitigation strategy that pulls in as many of the mitigations from the different parts of the organization as possible, so that we have a very comprehensive list of mitigations against any particular hazard in order to help to describe to regulators the extent to which we've gone to the mitigation. And in a lot of cases, currently, when people do their design controls, there's a lot of discussion about design mitigations, but not so much about manufacturing mitigations. And then labeling, manufacturing, training, all the different kind of aspects of the device design, I think we want to pull all that into the design control if possible. So just a note on that. And again, they're pretty specific in that there's no room for economic consideration in the need for risk mitigation. So they're really not interested in this as low as reasonably possible. I think when you get into the definition of reasonably, what they're looking for is no excuses from the standpoint of what it costs to do the mitigation. Another requirement is that we're supposed to do a risk-benefit analysis for all the risks. So a line-by-line, every risk that you've identified, every hazard harm combination that you've identified in your design control strategy. The idea is that you would do a risk-benefit analysis for each line item, which is a little different than what we've seen in the past. Mitigations or control options should be sufficient to create an inherently safe design. So when we're doing that line-by-line evaluation, the idea is you get to the end of it on that line, and you make a company and an engineering decision that we've sufficiently mitigated this risk. So there should be a mechanism in your controls to do that and make sure that each line item has been evaluated on that level. Information given to the users does not reduce the residual risk any further. So in other words, when you have a warning in your labeling, you can't use that to reduce the hazard probability of occurrence. And so the challenge there is there's certain things, contraindications just being one example, where you say the user should not do this activity. If they do the activity, then there's going to be a problem. And the only way to really mitigate that is by telling them. Well, one of the ways of controlling that is to say, because what they're saying here is that if you put a label in your IFU, your instructions for use, then you won't be able to say that because you told the user that the incidence of that risk is going to increase or decrease. So what we've done in the design control is to add another work item that's a training work item. And so the idea there is to split the labeling from the training and use the training as the method for reducing the probability of occurrence. So whether you do it that way or you do it a different way, I think you want to spend a little bit of time understanding or coming up with a strategy for when you have a situation like that where you're using labeling to reduce the occurrence, that there might be a different argument to make. So that kind of brings us to the typical FMEA risk analysis method that people would use. And the problem with this method is it's difficult to use a spreadsheet like this in the analysis, and there's a variety of reasons. The harm definition typically in this kind of a case where you're doing a component or bottom-up analysis of your hazards, what you end up doing is it drives to the harm. So you end up discussing what the component is, the description, what could possibly go wrong with it, and then if something goes wrong with it, what is the implication? Well, the typical way to do this from a workflow standpoint is to fill it out in a spreadsheet as in a meeting with a bunch of people that are associated with the product. And you type in the harms. Well, some of these harms are the same, could be potentially the same, but they might be slightly different in that, as one example, minor bleeding or not too much bleeding or insignificant bleeding. So you can have all kinds of different discussions and have those actually be the same thing. So it's really helpful to start a harm database where you reuse the harm directly as a defined item rather than typing it into a text field. So I think just from the standpoint of overall project security and having the proof work properly, you really would like to have those harms be defined in one database. So that's just one problem that needs to be fixed. Hazard combinations must be evaluated. So in the past, what I've done is have a discussion about whether the mitigation is required based on the risk priority level that's been calculated. And so internally, often companies have this progression where you say a 1, we don't have to mitigate. 2s, we might think about it. 3, we always have to mitigate, that type of thing. Well, now the idea is that you mitigate every risk and you do it to the level possible, not to the level where it's below a certain level in some kind of arbitrary scale. So that is a different approach to it, and completely in the past, and I've seen this done many different ways, risk controls in a spreadsheet format like this where you have one cell, it's difficult to get all of the risk mitigations into the cell. And I think at this point what we really are looking for is a comprehensive risk mitigation strategy with all the manufacturing, quality control, inspections, audits, process validation, design considerations. We want all those risk controls in there so that when we have an audit and maybe there's a harm that's happened in the field, we can quickly back into all the hazards that are associated with that harm and the comprehensive risk management or mitigation strategy. So I think we want to get a significant improvement in this area. And then, of course, the ALARP implies, it doesn't really mean that, but it does imply an economic consideration in that what do we mean by reasonable. So just to outline some of the problems that are associated with a typical FMEA risk analysis method. So clearly we need a new direction. Polarian's a great tool for bringing those standards into an operational development plan, and it creates a real flexible definition of the logical artifacts. So this is kind of like legal work in that what we're doing is we're drawing a circle around a certain type of logic, and then we're connecting those logical artifacts together. And the way that we do that is, and the way they're connected is with relationship logic, where we say this type of work item is caused by that type of work item. And the way and then so the definition of each of those work items is very important to closing out the proof when we're done. So when we say something's a requirement, we have a very specific idea of what a requirement is and how that requirement is tied out in the design control. So let's just go ahead and move on to the design control schema. So essentially, what is a work item? And I'm hoping that most people here know how this works inside of Polarian, but work item, its definition is essentially it's a logical artifact with defined attributes. So any logical thing that you can think of can be defined as a work item. It's as some examples, functional requirement, a test plan, a hazard, a harm, a user need. So anything that you can have a very clear defined definition of what it is, we can create a work item around that. And then of course some of the artifact linking logics, verified by, causes, validated, parent-child relationships, just about anything you can think of from the standpoint of relationship logic. You can define it as that and then link them together. And of course, the search engine in Polarian is very robust. So if you want to search on the basis of the type of work item, search on the basis of the relationship logic between the work items, parent-child relationships, just about anything that you want, you can search on that basis. And in the template, we have a variety of canned different types of searches, but anything that you can think of, you can basically do a search on once you've defined the relationships and populated them. So design controls construction, again, the outputs of the design shall be provided in a form that enables verification against the design and development input. And so the model from the standpoint of what we call these work items, I've used the FDA's medical device design guidance. I think it's a 1998 standard is the last time they've updated this, but what I wanted to do in the template is use definitions of items that are familiar to the FDA and to ISO. And so both ISO and FDA are familiar with these terms and would be comfortable with them in a submission. So that's really why we tried to circle the names around what people would expect. So essentially what we have here is a flowchart that represents the design proof. And so the FDA's definition, I don't know if anybody's gone through this, but essentially what the FDA talks about when they talk about user needs and product requirements is they have an example of building a building, and the building has a user need of that it be warm, so to the user, that it be comfortable. And then, of course, the product requirements are associated with the engineering refinement of that user need, where we say, that means we're going to have a system that has, 25 CFM of flow. It's going to manage the air temperature between these two points, a set of engineering requirements that's very specific and testable. Okay, it is 25 CFM. It does manage the temperature between, 15C and 30C or some number like that. So the idea being that the product requirement is an engineering spec that you can test against, and that if those tests are met, we believe as an engineering or as a company that the user need would then be met. And then, of course, you do a validation test, not a verification test of the user need to bring a bunch of people in and say, are they comfortable in the room? So the idea here is, and that's hence the relationships between these work items. The user need is kind of a marketing product need. The device will be sterile, as an example. The device will be comfortable in the hand of a doctor. Any kind of general need. And then what we do is we come in behind it with product requirements that are testable engineering specifications, basically. Not specifications, that's the wrong word, but testable requirements, product requirements. So instead of saying the device will be sterile, you'd say it's going to be EO sterilized per ISO 11135. So an ISO 11135 gives all the testing requirements for the sterility of the product. So it's a testable requirement. So then we'd have a functional test case that would verify the product requirement, and that would be in the form of any kind of, the test department would write that protocol per the product requirement to assure that the product requirement was met, and then probably another type of functional test case that would be a validation test for the user need. So essentially what we end up doing is tying out this product requirement and proving that the product requirement has been met, and then after that has been done, we would go and do a validation test against the user need. And of course, what's left in this is the actual product, which is the specification. So if you have a subassembly or a piece of object code or an electrical design for a board layout, that's the specification. The specification is defined as satisfying the product requirement. So this encompasses really the requirements for doing the product design proof. So next piece of this is, and just to have a discussion about this, not only, and I think the point of this is, not only do we have a user need, but oftentimes we have more than one requirement that ties out that user need. So if it's going to be delivered sterile, not only would we have a requirement for the sterilization of the product, but we'd also have packaging requirements and a few other, maybe many other requirements defining what it is that we mean by a sterile product. And then, of course, you can have a many relationship in that, many to one, in that you have multiple test cases may be required to tie out a requirement. So a great example of that is the ISO 11135. Not only do we want to do a process validation against that requirement, but we're also going to have to do product requirements verification. So it's very flexible in that you can do one-to-many, many-to-many, many-to-one relationships with the tool, and pretty much encompass any kind of logic that you're trying to get into. So the second piece is the manufacturing piece. The manufacturing requirement is a satisfaction of the specification. So if the specification says that you'll use a validated cycle for doing EO sterilization, for example, then that manufacturing requirement would be validated by a process validation and or verified by inspections or supplier controls. An example of that is seals on a sterile barrier bag. You might have an internal process validation on the last seal, but the process validation is being done by the supplier for the other 3 seals as they're purchased. So in that case, an audit would cover the 3 seals, whereas an internal process validation would cover the last seal. So you got to have a couple different methods of making sure that you tie out all these manufacturing requirements that are satisfactions of the specification. So, and this is important for essentially the overall risk management piece. And so this print, and it's a little busy, I understand that, but it's an addition to the basic design control loop or proof, and then the manufacturing piece. And so what we're doing now is we're adding all the risk management to this so that it becomes an integrated risk management strategy. So essentially what we have is a harms down progression, which is, I've gotten into a couple audits, one of them with BSI for the ISO side of things, for their R1345 certification. And what they basically said was they didn't want to see a traditional FMEA format for a risk analysis. What they wanted was a harms-based risk management strategy. And so they want you to drive everything in your risk management up to the harm so that they can evaluate, in the end, what they're looking for is to evaluate the impact to the user. So essentially what we have here is another set of link relationships and work items that are associated with the hazards or with the risk management strategy. So both requirements and user needs can be used as mitigations to a hazard. And so these mitigations are typically drawn out in the FMEA, but the design FMEA. So what we're trying to do here in the design FMEA is to understand from a component level up what hazards are associated with breakage or poor design of the product. Then on the other side, we have manufacturing requirements, and so the mitigations and those product manufacturing requirements are often pulled out of a PFMEA. So where we're focused in from the process up, how is it that a machine that's making this product can break or malfunction and give us product that is a bad product. So we have really two pathways of populating our hazards. And so essentially what they are views of this hazard and how we're going to get a complete and full list of the hazards so that when we get to the final analysis that we're sending into the regulators, we can have a discussion about the harm and say we've fully vetted what we believe the hazards that can cause this harm are. And not only that, but we've got a complete list of mitigations to the hazard that represent everything that we're going to do to mitigate this hazard, and we believe that the hazard mitigation is sufficient. So we want to have a very complete list if possible. And that way, when we get an audit, no matter where they hit you in the audit, say they go into your process validation and say, we have a process validation that we believe is wrong, what's the impact to the user? Well, immediately you can back in and get a progression right up to the harm and say, if we have a problem with the process validation on a bar sealer or a gluing process or whatever, we expect that if there's a problem with that process validation, it's going to result in X harms, and then we can look in the field and quickly see whether we saw an increase in that harm or not. So the idea being, no matter where they hit you in the design control, that you can back out or move forward. Maybe you start with a harm and you do some post-market evaluation and find that you got an increase in a particular type of harm. What you should be able to do quickly is go back and say, what is my mitigation strategy for that harm? What are all the hazards associated with it? And where are we missing something? So it just really makes this post-analysis much, much easier without having to dig through all the design controls and search on the basis of harms that are not defined, and it just is a much cleaner way to do it. So just to give you a sense of flaring output in this, and now I'm doing this for a reason, but what you start out with is the harm in the left column. So when we do this wiki output to show all the hazards, the harms, the hazards, and the mitigations, this is the format that it comes in. So in this case, infection at the surgical site, then we have a variety of different hazards that can ruin the sterility chain, and then the mitigations for each one of those, whether they're design-related, manufacturing-related, labeling, whatever. So that kind of gives you a sense of the progression. It's a harms-down approach. Now, harms-down approaches are typically kind of when you start with the fault, and where this is what goes wrong, and what are all the things that can cause that thing to go wrong. That's typically known as a fault tree analysis. So it's really more, the progression that we have in the final submission is really more of a fault tree analysis progression, where you're starting with the harm, hazards, mitigations. But there's a whole bunch of different risk analysis tools. And the reason we selected that progression is because really that's what the regulatory bodies are looking for. They're looking for a harms-based approach. But there are a variety of different ways to ferret out what different hazards there are associated with the product, starting from doing root cause analysis, or you can do FMEAs both from a process and a design. There's criticality analysis, of a whole bunch of different tools that you can use to get to what hazard. But in the end, what we want is in the design control for that data to get populated into it in a way that gives us a final report that really is a very clear understanding of hazard to users versus all the, or I should say harm to users versus all the hazards that cause them. So just, I think a lot of times what happens is people see FMEA as their risk analysis tool, and which is fine, but at some point in time you want to get down to a level where we're talking about what each harm is associated with the hazard. So FMEA is just one of the tools that you use to get at those hazards. RPL calculation. RPL in our vernacular is risk priority level. I don't know, I'm sure there's 100 different ways to define that term, but essentially what we're saying is for this hazard harm combination, we think that this is a high or a low risk in total. There's a whole bunch of different ways people use to calculate these values. They weight them differently. So often what you'll see is the severity times occurrence times detection, although I've seen the weighting of severity and occurrence and detection very different. In other words, severity is maybe a 1 to 5 scale, or occurrence might be a 1 to 20 scale. So pretty much we can do anything you like, and I would expect that almost everyone would have a different method there, because it's just really common for people to do it differently. To go back to our definition, essentially in the template what we have is a harm is defined as an injury to the user and is the container for severity. So, which makes sense. When you've defined what the user injury is, you have enough to define how bad it is. Is it a death-related incident? Is it a severe injury incident? What is it that happened to the user allows you to define the severity. The hazard, though, when you define the non-function, or I should say the failure mode, and you define the cause of the failure mode, that's what really gives you how often it happens and whether you can detect whether it happens. So the container for the occurrence and detection is the hazard. And so this kind of goes to the discussion before, where if you start bleeding definitions over into each other, it becomes impossible then to define what the occurrence and detection is if half the definition of the hazard is someplace else, if it's not actually in the harm. So I've had a variety of people suggest that you have a work item called a cause that links into the hazard, which is fine, but you have to have the cause along with the failure mode to be able to determine what the occurrence is. So you have to think in terms of a database, where are the numerical values going to reside? And if you can do that, then you have a kind of a self-contained work item. Just to give you a sense of the progression, so overdose with radiation, and then of course we can have more than one hazard that causes that harm, and then a variety of mitigations. So again, it's a one-to-many relationship if you choose to make it that way, and it really provides a very flexible way to describe the harms down risk management approach. So one of the things, as I said before, is this tool is a very searchable tool. And what it allows you to do is search on the basis of almost any of the artifacts. So some of the quality control measures that are possible, harm coverage, do you have at least one hazard associated with the harm? Requirement coverage, does each requirement have at least one test case? The risk management trace matrix with the RPL, and that allows you to evaluate the mitigations associated with each hazard. So then the question is, when you get into these things, is it sufficient just to do a report and say, do we have at least one hazard associated with the harm, or one mitigation associated with the hazard? And the answer is really no. What we need to do from a workflow standpoint, at the end of this, is make an engineering judgment as to whether we believe that there is a sufficient mitigation, or whether all the hazards have been evaluated, to make sure that we have a complete file. And really, it's an engineering discussion and or a project management discussion that needs to happen on a line-by-line item basis. So you really want a workflow that allows you to make that check and report on the check as you go along. Just as another note, you can make a whole bunch of other types of work items that really end up being very convenient in the design controls. One of them is to list your standards, and the standards, and what I've done in a variety of projects is to take the standards and make them normative standards in my product requirements document, and then tear the standards down by product requirements, just like I do my product requirements document. And that's a really powerful way. So just as an example, IEC 62304 for software is a standard developed for medical device software actually residing on the medical device, or software that is a medical device. Well, when people ask whether a product is compliant, the real answer is does it comply with the 62304 standard? Well, the best way to find out is to pull the standard in, tear it down just like you do a product requirements document, and then run a test against it. And if you have that standard pre-processed, then you just pull it in as a normative standard to the product requirements document, and all the requirements for the 62304 come with it. You can imagine that's a huge savings of time. Once you get the standard really vetted, any project that you do, then you wouldn't have to go through and re-understand what that 62304 standard means. In addition to that, you do it by revision. So say you go from 2007 to 2014, now you can evaluate the previous standard against the new one and identify specifically which product requirements or standard requirements have changed, so you can do both a differential on the standards and also find out which products that you've done over the past X number of years have been impacted by that standard, so you'd know where the standard is referenced. So you could do a search on cross-product and find out where standards are referenced. So it's a really powerful tool for product development. Defined terms, that's another thing. Just drives me crazy that when you're in a product development process and you have 150 documents and you have defined terms in all the different documents, and all the defined terms are defined differently. So you have a test standard and you'll have a definition for hazard that's different than in your product development standard or whatever. Well, if you create a work item that is the defined term, then you just copy them from one place to the other, and whenever the defined term changes, it'll be updated in all the documents, which is really kind of a great, it's kind of a like solid modeling in that it's a parametric model. You update the defined term, and then it updates the rest of the files for you, and would give you an impact as to where they are if you like. Images is another good one. Text fields is terrific. So if you want to do a justification instead of, and so maybe you have a product requirement that comes from a standard that you don't believe is applicable to your product, but the standard is part of what you're saying you're using as part of your submission. Well, what you'd like to do then is say, well, we have a requirement here that's not applicable, and so you could create a text field that is a justification for not doing that test, and then document it in your design control. Really great way to integrate your justifications into your design controls. So just a few ideas on things that really don't have anything to do with the overall proof that you're trying to achieve, but rather just project management niceties. Just wanted to also talk about critical control documents. So typically people expect and call kind of the following, but they call them different things. Project plan, of course, the product requirements document, and usually, or often anyway, these are broken up into multiple documents themselves, software, hardware, or system subsystems. So there's all kinds of different ways to organize them. But once you say, I'm going to put my product user needs and product requirements into my product requirements, the PRD, product requirements document, that becomes the container for those work items. And I think it's very, all this to say that you really want to sit down and think a little bit about what work items land in what documents, or do you want them to land in documents at all? I've seen implementations where the people just use the repository, they create the requirement in the repository, and they don't actually live in any documents. I wouldn't recommend that, just because often work items are very much better understood when they're put in context with other kinds of information. So a harms document, as an example, you might want all kinds of information in there, from field reports, and maybe have a clinician sign off on the harms document. So in the end, you have a document that really ties out the harms, and you have somebody checking on the severities to be sure that it's justifiable that you're putting a 3 instead of a 5 on some particular harm. And then also hazards. I've got it broken out into a separate hazards document, and the reason for that is often hazards come with testing that is associated with the definition of how often the hazard happens, and or testing that that proves that the hazard is of a particular occurrence level. And there's usually a particular group of people that evaluate those, and so because that group of people is different than the clinicians that are evaluating the harms, it's convenient to put them in a different document. But then, of course, product realization, I have in there process validation work, inspections, our quality management plan, all the aspects of what you need to actually create the product or reside in the product realization plan. And then, of course, you got a design transfer. The design requirements trace matrix and the risk trace matrix are just different in that they have different views of the data. The design requirements is a user needs requirements test case view. So if you're searching on whether product requirements are covered with test cases, that'd be a better way to go. And then, of course, risk management is harm hazard mitigation test case. So, and then, of course, all that leads to the design V&V test plan. So all this to say that when you create a progression of documents in your design control, you want to think a little bit about what the logic of those documents is and where the work items reside. So some takeaways. There's many ways. This kind of goes to my initial statement. There's a million ways to do this, and to do it in a compliant way. And I've seen many different ways of doing risk management that are acceptable to regulators. The idea here is that we're just giving you some idea of how to logically structure it in a way that makes it a whole lot easier for you as you're going forward. You're going to need a lot of flexibility to accommodate different project needs. So you can imagine that a project that's organized by subassembly, you have a robot, and then you have a graphical interface, and then top-level software, and they're all being developed by different people. Your document structure is going to be different for those kind of products because you're going to want to use the documents to control your suppliers. So, and as an example, another way, sometimes people organize them by silos. We have the software people, we have hardware, and then we have electrical. And so depending upon how you organize your product, it's altogether likely that you're going to structure those documents differently, and possibly your work items differently, because you may call the work items different things based on what you do internally. So I would consider flexibility in the tool, because it's almost a certainty that you're going to want to do it a little differently than what's been presented. And just for a point of reference, often people put this off towards the end of the product, and you can imagine if you've defined everything as a product requirement, now you want to break those product requirements up into 15 different types of product requirements, that it's going to require redefinition of the work items, it can be a lot of work. If you're in a really big product and you have 10,000 requirements, you can imagine that would take you some time to get through it all. So I'd suggest a very early view of getting your structure put together. So that pretty much concludes the presentation. Hopefully this has been something that's valuable to you. I'd be happy to answer any questions. So that's the conclusion. Thank you for listening. I'm not sure if we're going to get the other people back or not.
So thank you very much for that, Larry.
Sure.
If you don't mind,
thanks,
could you
Eddie.
pass me the presenter at all?
Yeah, thank you.
And what we'll do, we have just a few more minutes in today's webinar. What I want to do now is just go through a little bit about polaring and show off some of the features of polaring that really tie in with what Larry has presented today. Just mostly the ability to sort and to link and to display the items in a manner that is sort of in the manner that is necessary. Let me go ahead and share my desktop then. And what I have today is a project called the Bionic Arm Project. And this is a fictitious sort of arm exoskeleton project that we've created just to demonstrate some of the concepts behind our medical device system. And as Larry mentioned, we do store all of our information in what we call work items. And of course, our system is a little bit different than what Larry has put together. Ours is tends to be a little bit more general, just because we work with customers that are not just medical device manufacturers, but create other products as well. But as was mentioned, everything here is stored as a work item, and everything is very granular in that respect. So we see here, this is a example of a requirement work item. The most important thing about this is not that it is a requirement, but that you can take this and you can store any sort of information that you want within it. So I can change these fields, I can change the work item. But if I come over here to this next screen, what we're seeing here, this is sort of the start of the whole structure that Larry had presented, is that we can take all of our system requirements and we can trace down and we can sort of break those down into the individual components. And this is whether or not it's a electrical requirement, for example, sort of going on down into a test case, but also even taking that requirement and breaking it down into the different hazards that may occur due to the failure of that requirement, the test cases that test against it. And what we'll actually see is that this requirement here, let's open up 1008, has several requirements, and some of these are actually in different projects. So what we call the medical risks are ISO 14971 project. And what we've done is we've taken these hazards, for example, MR 1075 here, which is the malfunction of the microhydraulic motor, and linked it back up to that requirement. And again, this creates that permanent link so that when you do have a failure, when something does need to be changed, you have that ability to go ahead and perform that impact analysis for. What you'll see as well, though, is we actually create our combinations of risks or sort of harms and hazards through this linking process as well. So this hazard, in addition to be linking to the requirement that it sort of affects, is linked to a specific harm itself. So finger dislocation in this case. And what we've done is we've taken all of this and we've put them into a what we call a wiki page. And this is sort of a replacement of the normal Excel spreadsheet that you would use to sort of fill this out, either sort of an FMEA format or in this harms and hazards-based format. But what it does is it takes the harms and the hazards that are linked together. Automatically, it takes the severity values from the harm and takes the occurrence and detection rating from the hazards, and then, as was mentioned, creates an RPL from this. And this happens automatically whether or not there is a sorry, as soon as you create a harm and hazard pair, this will happen automatically. So there's no need to go through and actually update your spreadsheet. If I were to, for example, take this harm, MR1028, and if I were to create a new hazard for this, and I'll go ahead and say, something along these lines. As soon as I go ahead and fill this out, I can always come back to my spreadsheet here and see the changes that are made. So this was to, the harm was 1028. if we come down here to 1028, we see that we have our brand new harm here, or sorry, our brand new hazard. And that, again, that's one of the big benefits, is that although this presentation and a lot of the ways that items are tracked are similar to what you've done in the past with Excel-based systems or whatnot, a lot of it becomes automated and also becomes enforceable, right? Because I have these links and I have these things contained within the system, I can actually produce rules that allow me to look for the existence of harms and hazards, look for the existence of test cases when I go through my requirements process. More importantly, though, and something Larry brought up at the very beginning of his presentation, is the ability to actually link mitigating items to my my risks. Instead of just having a cell which may not be enough space, which doesn't have direct linkage to the actual action that you've taken, I can come into my system and I can actually create a mitigating action that is directly linked to my hazard. And again, this list of mitigating items can be varied and can be tailored towards the actions that you take. And Larry's template does have quite a few differences from the one that we're seeing here. But it becomes easy to go ahead and say that, you know, in order to avoid this hazard, I do need a requirement that is avoid clamping force is too high. And again, as soon as I create that, I come back to my spreadsheet here. And again, it becomes automatically updated, and there is really no limit to the number of mitigating actions you can have attached to one harm hazard pair. In this case, we do have one here, but as you see, several of these items do have multiple items attached to them. So this harm hazard pair has 3 items, and we can see sort of the change in the RPL and the risk occurrence and detection. Lastly, with Polarian, one thing that wasn't mentioned a great deal, but one of the big benefits of Polarian, especially when it comes to medical device manufacturing and any real industry that requires auditing, is that everything that is done in Polarian is tracked by our revision control system, which allows me to come into an item, for example, the one I just created here, and see an entire history. My apologies, we didn't actually make any changes to that one. Let's go back to our requirement here and see any changes that were made to this item across its entire history. So if you do go ahead and revise a requirement or revise mitigating action to comply with a risk or to mitigate a risk, there is proof of who made the changes, when the changes were made, and exactly what changes those are. And so it brings everything to one nice system where all of the information, both the relational information between your items in your system and also the historical information for each of those items is contained in one location. All right, and so we have just about 5 minutes of time left. I did want to save some time at the end for Q&A. Vera, do you have any questions that you would like to have Larry or myself answer?
As mentioned at the beginning, please submit any questions you have that are pertinent to the overall group in the chat box. Some of them I will follow up individually that have already been submitted, but here are 2 that have been provided that are pertinent to the larger group. The first one was, how are the FMEA and the harms down evaluation methods different? And this is probably a question for Larry.
Yeah, so essentially I think the difference between the harms evaluation and it's a top-down fault tree analysis, more of a view of it, whereas the finite element or the failure mode effect analysis is a view coming from the bottom up typically. So if it's a design failure mode analysis, we'd start with the component and go to the functional description of the component, and then that would lead us to things that could go wrong. You know, so you'd say we have a brake assembly. The functional description of the brake is that it stops something. Well, what can go wrong? Well, we can have a design that's too weak. When the doctor pushes it, it breaks the design. So we want to do some kind of a a mitigation against that. So it's really a bottom-up approach. Process, of course, is similar, but instead of starting with the components, you're starting with the process used to fabricate the components and all the actuations and temperatures and controls that are associated with the fabrication equipment. An example in software is the actual software build, where you're saying, I'm going to take a couple of these objects and I'm going to combine them into a top-level object. Does it work as we expected it to? And when we compile that code, does it grab the right pieces of the code? So it's really, both of those methods are really bottoms up, whereas what we have in the risk management is a tops down fault tree analysis, really starting with the risk. So.
Great. The second question also for you, Larry, I think, posed, which essentially is in the context of a template, what does it mean to be ISO 62304 compliant?
Oh, well, that's a good question. So the ISO 62304 is a standard really focused on medical device software, and so you can imagine that it has all kinds of requirements that are really not related to the template. One example of that is how is well, I shouldn't say not related to the template, but it's how is the maintenance of the software going to be done. And when you have a change to some object or some unit of software clear down in the design, what impact does that have on the progression of the software up through the assembly? And what testing would have to be done to revalidate or re-verify that software, either one. So the 62304 has a lot of discussion about how to structure your architecture and what the impact of that is on the maintenance. So the template, its responsibility in this is to make sure that when you've defined those categories as they are defined in the 62304 standard, that you use them that way, or that they be able to be linked that way. But compliance with the standard has more to do, frankly, with your overall software development SOP and what you put into the containers that are defined in the template. So the template gives you the ability to be compliant with the standard, but certainly it's not all sufficient. It's really the responsibility of the development team to properly populate it. So it's kind of a split responsibility.
Great. I don't see any more questions coming in. So, and we're at the end of the time. Anyways, thank you again so much, Larry from Samson Surgical and Andy Holton from Polarium. Immediately following the close of the webinar, you will receive a short evaluation. It'd be great if you could complete it to help us refine our webinar series. And a recording will be sent to you via email, which we hope you will share with your colleagues, of course. And all of our webinars are searchable in our on-demand library at polarium.com, and a really good way for you to stay in touch and abreast of information from us is through our blog, our Twitter feed, and Facebook page. Thank you again, everybody, for your time today, and we hope we see you again soon with another webinar.